Welcome back to The Wheel on the School, Chapter 8. Chapter 8, Lena and the Upturned Boat. The third little side road that Lena went down was the worst. She had gone singing down the other two lanes to let the people, and especially the watchdogs, know that someone was approaching. Luckily, there had been someone at each house to hush the awful growlings of the watchdogs. The people on these back roads had seemed only too pleased to have a young girl come visiting them. They had exclaimed and clucked sympathetically when Lena explained the wagon wheel on the School for Storks project. Everybody had thought it the nicest idea. Shora lies so bare and naked against its dike, one woman had said. It sure could stand some storks to warm it up. But nobody had had a wheel to spare. But dearie, the woman had said, if we had a spare wheel, you could be sure it would be on our own lonely roof. Every day I see the storks flying over, I wish I had a wheel. It's so quiet here and storks are such company. The third dirt road seemed to have only one farmhouse, which was at its very end. There didn't seem to be a soul around. Nothing stirred in that farmyard except some chickens and a goose under a wagon. Lena wished now she'd first run to the dike before going down this road. She wished she'd come singing, but she'd been thinking about what all the nice people had said on the farms on the other two roads. Here, in the awful silence, was nothing but a goose and some chickens under a wagon at the end of a short drive that led into the farmyard. Lena took one step into the lane. Up in the wagon rose an enormous dog. All of a sudden there he stood, growling and barking, with the growls running under the quick short barks, the growling never stopping. Lena stood frozen where she stopped. The deep growling seemed to run along the ground at her. Her spine turned cold. She couldn't see whether the dog was tied in the wagon. What if he'd come in one leap from the wagon? What then? Nothing stirred. Not a thing. Lena did not know what to do. If she turned and ran, as all her quaking body wanted to do, the dog might come tearing after her. Now, at least, he only watched her with hard eyes and warned her away with his awful hoarse growling. A desperate plan came to Lena. She began singing at the dog. She didn't know what else to do. It came out queer and quavery, but she sang. She forced herself to sing louder. It had to sound as if she were coming on. She sang at the dog with all her might. The surprised dog stayed on the wagon, but his ears flew erect at the shrill sound of the words that Lena sang at him. His growling had stopped. He uttered one bewildered bark, then stood and stared in confusion. His ears pricked high. It encouraged Lena. She sang and sang, and as she sang, she backed away. Any old song, any words. The dog couldn't know if they were right or wrong. She didn't herself. Then at last a hedgerow along the road hid the dog from sight for a moment. Lena turned and fled. She kept singing wildly and looking over her shoulder. The dog was not following her. For all that, Lena shouted her song all the way back to the dike and up the dike. On the high dike, she felt safe. She dropped in a panting heap on top of the dike. Now, across the field, she could see the dog. He was still on the wagon. He had not moved except to turn his body from the lane toward the dike. His hard eyes still seemed to look at her. Lena shuddered. Lena knew she could never nerve herself to go down another lane to another farmhouse, never. Her throat felt scratchy and raw from her hard singing. She never wanted to sing that song again either. Whatever it had been. All she knew was that she felt sweetly safe here on the dike. Nothing could take you by surprise. You could see anything coming. She looked away from the dog and out over the quiet sea behind the dike. The tide was out. The water shimmered in the far distance, but below the dike the sea bottom stretched hard and dry in the ebb tide. With loud, alarmed squawks, a heron flew up from the dry sea. It fluttered awkwardly, then came to rest on an old, upturned boat lying far out from the dike. The heron stood silhouetted against the high blue sky and the faraway blue of the water. It preened its feathers. A heron wasn't a stork, but Lena stared fascinated at the lone bird on the lonely, forsaken boat. Teacher had said to look wherever a wheel couldn't possibly be. Well, a wheel couldn't possibly be in a boat, especially not under a stranded, overturned boat that had been lying there upside down for years. It had been lying there as long as history. A boat must certainly be the last place for a wagon wheel. But in such places, Teacher had said, the unexpected could happen, could come up to surprise you. And there were no dogs in the sea. Slowly Lena crossed the dry strand, skirting the few puddles left in hollow places from the last flood tide. Even as quietly as Lena came, the heron heard her. With a loud, disagreeable squawk, it flapped up and flew away over the dike. Lena was alone in the silent, dry stretches of the mysterious sea. Before her loomed the dark old boat. It was difficult to know how to climb to the top of the high, round-bottomed fishing boat. Why, she wanted to get on the boat. Lena didn't exactly know, except that she was Try that sentence again. Why she wanted to get on the boat, Lena didn't exactly know, except that now she was here, it seemed she had to do something. She couldn't just walk around it and walk back to sit on the dike. The whole boat looked slippery and slimy with seaweeds and sea scum. It was crusted all over with strange rotted growths. Big crabs scurried under the boat. It was so still here, Lena could hear the scuttling, clicking movements of the hard-shell crabs. Snails and other slow, slimy sea animals clung and moved everywhere among the weeds and rotted wood. Lena walked around the boat once again. There was only one way to get up on it. An old anchor chain still hung at the stern. It was as coated and slimy as all the rest. If she clung to the chain and pulled herself up by it, she could sort of walk up the rounded stern if she took her wooden shoes off. Lena considered. She really should take her socks and stockings off too, but the thought of climbing the crusted boat with her bare toes among the slime and scum and moving things gave her cold horror. She'd just take her shoes off. But when she set her shoes on the dry sea bottom, they looked so tiny and helpless and out of place in the big sea that Lena felt wretched. She couldn't leave them behind. On sudden impulse, Lena pulled the ribbon out of her hair, strung it through 2 holes in the sides of her wooden shoes, and hung the shoes around her neck by the ribbon. Then, shutting her eyes tight, she grabbed the coated chain and, bracing her feet flat against the stern of the boat, hoisted herself up. It was far easier than she had expected. Lena was on the boat. She stood surprised and pleased. She looked about her proudly, wishing that somebody could have seen her. Yella thought only boys could climb and jump. If it wasn't for skirts and dresses, she thought she could outclimb big heavy Yella any old day. Oh, but it was quiet here. She wished now the heron had stayed. Lena hurriedly undid the ribbon from her shoes and put them back on. She left the ribbon around her neck. Her hands were too dirty for her to put the ribbon back in her hair. She immediately felt much better with her shoes on. She moved carefully forward, feeling her way over the slippery boat bottom among the tiny scurrying animal insect things. There was a hole in the boat. A square hole had been cut into the bottom of the upside-down boat. But whatever for? Lena edged carefully toward the yawning hole, dropped to her knees, and queasily peered it down. There was utter darkness and silence below except for the small faint sounds of crab scuttlings. Gradually, Lena's eyes became used to the darkness. Suddenly, she thrust herself deep into the hole, head and shoulders, her eyes trying to pierce the darkness, trying to make sure. It wasn't. It couldn't be. It was a wheel. Lena pulled her head out of the hole and glanced about her, blinking in the sunlight. Her mouth went partly open as if to shout the news to someone, but there was no one. And now in the stillness and sunlight, she couldn't believe it herself anymore. She must have imagined it in the darkness. Once more she plunged head and shoulders into the hole and hung down as far as she dared. It was so. It was a wheel. It was all but swallowed up in sea silt, but she could see part of a spoke, a little section of rim, and the big hub jutting out of the silt. A wagon wheel was under an old, forgotten, turned-up boat. It couldn't be, but it was. Lena jumped to her feet. She danced a little dance all around the hole, forgetful of slime and slipperiness. She sang a little song in the stillness of sea, danced and sang. It seemed to be the same song she had sung to the watchdog. It still had no meaning, it still made no sense, but now it was happy. The song stopped abruptly in Lena's mouth. She stood still. Someone was watching her from the dike. It was old Douwe, and this was Douwe's boat, Lena knew. But she hardly knew old Douwe. Douwe lived in Shora, but you seldom saw him, because every day old Douwe took long walks along the dike, as far even as the village of Ternod. It took him all day, but the next day he would do it over again. Old Douwe was 93. Now Douwe was shouting at her from the dike, but Lena on the boat couldn't understand his hoarse old voice. "What did you say?" Lena called across the dry stretch of sea bottom. And then each word came slowly to her. Douwe was shouting them one by one. "Little girl, why were you dancing on my boat?" "I found a wheel! I found a wheel!" Lena cried back at him. "Oh, sure, but that's been there some 80 years. It overwhelmed Lena. She had to sit down. Imagine it. And Douwe had shouted it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A wheel in a boat for 80 years, and all the time old Douwe had known. And all the time through the search by the whole school, anyone could have gone up to him and said, "Douwe, where can I find a wheel?" And he would have replied, "Oh, under my boat." But who would have thought of asking Douwe? Douwe was almost 100 years old. 1,000 questions seemed to bubble up in Lena. 1,000 things she absolutely had to know about the wheel in the boat and about the hole. Why had they cut a hole in a boat? And everything and every amazing thing. Lena jumped to her feet, but you couldn't shout questions across such a distance. In her excitement, with her eyes fixed on Douwe and tingling to know, Lena ran down the rounded side of the boat and jumped to the packed sea bottom. She landed hard on her hands and feet. One wooden shoe had made a splitting sound, but there was no time to think about that now. Lena picked herself up and raced across the sea bottom to the dike. But when at last she stood before old Douwe on the dike, she was too breathless for questions. Just why, the old man wanted to know, would a little girl be dancing on top of a boat because of a wagon wheel? Fortunately, he now noticed Lena's split shoe. It gave Lena a chance to catch her breath. "Better carry that shoe in your hand," Douwe said. "We'll go to my house and I'll staple a little fine wire over the vamp. It'll be good as new, if you don't jump from boats." But why were you doing that little dance there? You've got me as curious and inquisitive as old Grandmother Sybil." When Lena had her breath back, she explained why they wanted a wheel in Shora. She hurried to get it over with so she could ask Douwe why there was a wheel under a boat and why it seemed the most natural thing to him, when really it was a miracle and a wonder. "So you need that wheel for storks?" Douwe said. "Well, well, well." "But that square hole isn't nearly big enough to pull the wheel through," Lena told him. "No, of course not," Douwe said. "I cut it just big enough to pull a man through and not an inch bigger, not an inch." "A man?" "My father," Douwe said. "And that was my father's wagon wheel you saw. It saved his life." "But Douwe—" But old Douwe shook his head and pointed out to sea. A group of storks came winging out from sea, from far away near the islands. For a while they headed straight for Shora, straight toward Douwe and Lena. But near the old boat they swerved and flapped rapidly out of sight in the direction of Ness. "There must have been 20, Lena said, awed. "No, exactly 12, Douwe said. "But that isn't the point. If the storks are flying in flocks now and that wheel's got out of the boat, we can't stand here talking. Tomorrow's Sunday, so there are no days to waste. The tide is soon due in from the sea, so there are no hours to waste. Besides all that, there's a storm brewing far back off the islands." Lena looked all around at the sunshiny blue sky over the distant blue sea, then looked back at the old man in complete unbelief. "Oh yes, that storm's coming," Douwe said. "Oh, it isn't a matter of hours. It won't come in a minute. But it's going to be such a storm that the tide won't leave the dike again for days on end. So this is our last chance to get near the boat. You see, little girl, we've no time to waste and we'd better talk as we walk." "But where are we going? What will we do?" Lena asked anxiously. "We'll do what I did before, over 80 years ago. We'll go to my house to get my saw, and it's the same saw I used to cut my father out. Then we'll hurry back and cut the hole big enough to pull the wheel out." Old Douwe, aided by his stout cane, strode along the dike so fast that Lena, hobbling on one shoe, had all she could do to keep up with him. She stumbled along in a daze, bewildered and seething with more and more questions. Lena looked eagerly up at the old man a few times, then she burst out with it. "Douwe, I've got to know why there was a wheel in a boat, or I'll explode." Douwe grinned. "That's easy," he said, calmly, never slackening his long stride. "You see, my father was a fisherman, just like I was, and just as his father was before him. But all his life he was plagued by seasickness. He'd be sick all the weeks out on the sea and until he got back home again. He hated the sea, but it brought him his living. He was a fisherman like his father before him, so what could he do? Grub on the land? No, but do you know what he did? He put that wagon wheel on his boat. What belongs more with the solid, steady land than a wagon wheel? Nothing. It's reasonable, isn't it?" "Yes," Lena said in a small voice, picturing the seasick man, seasick all his life. "Oh, yes. But then how did the wagon wheel save him?" "There was the big storm. The fishing fleet didn't come back. It was a swift storm. It fell down on the fleet, and there was no running away from it or out before it. Not a boat came back. I was a little boy then in Shora. A week after the storm, the tides brought in my father's boat, the only boat from the Shora fleet that ever came back. But it came back upside down. It stranded just about where it's lying now. Nothing could have lived in an overturned boat through such a week-long storm. The whole village was in sorrow. Not a fisherman had come back. And there lay the boat, like a big tomb. Nobody went near it. I was a little boy, about as old as you are now. I used to go out on the dike and stare at the boat and cry all by myself. Every day, a little helpless, lonely boy. One day I got queer thoughts. I began dreaming things, imagining things, because it was too awful just staring at the boat that had been my father's tomb. I made up a story for myself, that my father was still in the boat, under the boat, but alive. It wasn't his tomb. Oh, it was foolish and wild, but it was so lonely when I cried there every day. Oh, it was impossible. But it was so, wasn't it? Lena said urgently, because it was so impossibly impossible. It was so. The old man looked at her. Precisely, he said, as if he were talking to a grown-up. Impossibly impossible, but exactly, he said. Little girl, how did you ever think of it? That's the way I wish I could have explained it, because that's the way I thought it as a child, but I had no words. Our teacher told us. Lena started to explain, but the old man was not listening. I went out to the boat, he said softly. The tide was out. The boat lay high. And there I stood beside the looming boat in the quiet sea, and I was scared, because this was my father's boat, and my father was gone. I couldn't believe my dreams out there in the sea. But just the same, I laid my ear against the side of the boat, and I listened a long time. I thought I heard a faint tapping. Oh, hardly louder than the noises of the hard-shell crabs. Then I was sure, and I yelled, "Dad, Dad!" I screamed, "Just wait! I'm coming back, Dad! I'm coming back to get you!" As if he hadn't been waiting there for days. I think I kept yelling and screaming, in between crying, all the way to Shora. I yelled down the street. Nobody would believe me. And my poor mother said, "No, Douwe, no, your father is gone. Hush, boy." Oh, I couldn't stop to explain. Everybody thought I was crazy. You don't know the awful, dreadful hurry. I grabbed an axe and a saw. I ran all the way back alone. I was little, but I was strong and I was excited. I chopped a hole in the bottom of the overturned boat, and when it was big enough to push a saw through, I sawed and sawed. And every once in a while I'd have to stop and yell, "Dad, Dad!" through the hole, and he answered me in a weak whisper of a voice. And then I'd saw like a maniac again. At last the hole was cut and I could push myself in. There was my father right below me, there on the wheel. The wheel was leaning against the side of the boat. With his last strength, my father had climbed to the hub to be as close to me as possible while I sawed, to be within reach. I leaned in. I grabbed him under the arms. I lifted him out. I was small, but I was strong. Right then, I could have lifted the church and the tower. Too, my father was just a light skeleton. Lena was crying a little as she hobbled beside the old man. He was striding so fast in his excitement of living it all over again, he was almost running. It was sweet to cry about it a little, because it had happened more than 80 years ago and was a miracle and a wonder. Now, how he lived under that boat all those days? The old man almost shouted. By climbing to the top of the wheel whenever the tide came in, so as to keep his head above water. The boat hadn't mired so deep in the sea silt then. The tide didn't flow over it in the way it does now. Know what he ate? Candles. Pieces of candles that they'd had in the boat came floating around him in the flood tides. Know what he drank? Fish and crabs. He'd chew the juices out of them for a little water and spit the salty raw flesh out again, but he was a skeleton. And there I stood on top of the boat, a boy with his father. I was almost crazy with excitement. And then, just the way you did, I ran down the side of the boat carrying my father. We landed in a heap, but I picked him up. I ran with him over the dry sea bottom and over the dike to Shora. I kicked the door open and I yelled, "Mom, here's my dad!" And my mother fainted. What a day! What a great day! Together they strode along the dike, and Lena looked up at the old man in wonder. "Now I'm doing it again," old Douwe said suddenly. "Almost a century later, I'm doing it again. Running home for the same saw. I'm going to do it again. Cut a hole, this time for my father's wagon wheel. And it's going on the school. You know, little girl, that this is wonderful, and that is right. The wheel on the school is a sort of memento to my father, who was saved by that wheel." Lena gasped. "Oh, yes, Douwe, yes. But we're going to need help to lift that waterlogged wheel out of the silt and up through the hole." "Won't it be rotten?" Lena asked anxiously. "After almost a century?" It seemed such endless ages. "It'll be as sound as the day it landed there. Under the water and in the moist silt, it would be almost eternal. Wood under salt water doesn't rot." "Then I'm going to run and tell the teacher," Lena said. "He'll ring the school bell and all the boys will come. They can help us, but it'll take a while. They're all over the countryside." "Fine," the old man said. "I'll get the saw and a shovel. We can start making the hole bigger and dig the wheel out of the silt while they come in from the country. Tell your teacher everybody's to hurry. The tide will soon be in. Here, give me that wooden shoe so I can fix it. No, better give me both. Then you can run faster and get to that school." Lena hastily handed the old man both her wooden shoes and dashed off. Far behind her, she could hear the old man's heavy cane pounding the brick in his fierce stride. There was no one in the school. The teacher was gone. The door of the school stood wide open, but there was no one. Lena rushed into the classroom and stood puzzled in the empty room. But the teacher had said he'd be at school all day. Maybe she'd better ring the bell to make them all come. Lena darted to the portal where the bell rope hung. There was no bell rope. Lena stared bewilderedly around her. Then, with a helpless shrug, she dashed out of the portal and back to the village and to old Douwe. The whole village seemed deserted. The street lay empty. Even grandmother Sybil III wasn't sitting on her stoop. Lena rushed on, looking everywhere. She came to a dead stop in the middle of the street. The gate to Janis's high-fenced backyard stood wide open. It was startling. It had never happened before. For a split second, Lena considered dashing in there. Oh, but that was silly. Janis had no legs. He'd be useless. In desperation, Lena ran past Douwe's house to the dike to see if, from the high dike, she could find any of the boys or the teacher somewhere in the level, flat fields. There was nothing in all the fields except the stooping figures of farm workers. Lena turned to look at the faraway upturned boat. There was old Douwe striding out along the dike toward the boat, an axe and a shovel and a coil of rope thrown over his shoulder. He hurried along with his big stout cane. He was carrying her shoes in his other hand. Douwe hadn't even waited for her. On silent stocking feet, Lena ran after him along the top of the dike. From a distance, Jana, the wife of Janis, coming home from her yoke and empty bread baskets, saw old Douwe rushing along the dike with the saw and shovel. Jana was far out along the road. She had been peddling bread to the outlying farms between Shora and Ness. Now there came Lena running hard after the old man. Jana set her baskets down in the middle of the road, rested her yoke, and stood and stared. Old Douwe plunged down the seaside of the dike and disappeared from Jana's view. A distance behind him, Lena too ran down the dike and disappeared. Jana, in a confused way, stooped to pick up a few smooth stones from the gravel road and started to drop them in a basket. Suddenly, she grabbed up her yoke and baskets and took off for Shora as fast as she could. Her billowing skirts fluttered. Lena at last caught up with Douwe as he was nearing the old boat. "Oh, you can walk," she panted. "I couldn't catch up, and I couldn't find anybody in Shora. Everybody's gone, even the teacher. Now what will we do?" "We'll do what we can, you and I. After that's done, we'll figure what to do next. No sense worrying ahead." "But how will you get up on the boat?" "How did you get up?" Douwe asked. "I climbed up by the anchor chain at the stern." "Then I'll have to climb up the anchor chain at the stern too." "But you're almost you're 93. "So I am, and that can't be helped. All I can do is try and climb." The old man chuckled proudly at Lena's unbelieving look. "Up you go first," he said. With a boost from Douwe, Lena climbed up easily. After handing her the long-handled shovel and throwing the saw and coil of rope up to her, old Douwe tossed up Lena's shoes for her to catch. Next, he tossed her his own. "Can't leave them down here in case the tide wants to come in," he said. "Hey, wait a minute, my cane!" He threw the cane up to Lena. "And now we commence to climb," he announced cheerfully. "Let my rope down, because I'm afraid I'm going to need a little help." He tied the rope around his chest. "I sometimes overestimate myself, but with you pulling as hard as you can, and me climbing as hard as I can, I believe we're going to make it." He grabbed the chain and, bracing his feet flat against the stern of the boat, started to come up. Halfway up, he was breathing hard. "Keep pulling," he gasped. "Pull harder." Lena tugged with fierce strength. The old man made a terrific scrambling effort, and up he came. For a moment, he stood teetering on the end of the boat, but he steadied himself, took a step forward, and let out a long breath. "You see," he said, "just between the two of us, and here I am." "Oh, Grandpa Douwe, you're wonderful," Lena said. "Don't you grandpa me," the old man ordered. "Grandpas sit in corners. They don't climb boats." But he had to sit down and rest a while. "You've got breath," he said. "Start sawing." The wood was old, but it was thick. The inner core of the heavy planks was sound and solid oak. Lena sawed until she could no longer move her arm up and down. She looked at her sawing. She had sawed no more than an inch of the thick wood, if that. She looked at Douwe. The old man chuckled. "You've got to learn to pace yourself. Steady does it. Long strokes, not that jerky jiggling." He got to his feet and came over to the hole. "Maybe I'd better saw when you dig, then we'll get two things done. You won't be scared down there in the dark with the crabs and things?" "Not with you up here and a wheel down there," Lena said stoutly. "But when we've got the hole sawed and the wheel dug free, then what? Can you and I get it out together?" "No, we can't," the old man said mildly. "But I think I've taken care of that. I saw you come running after me alone, so I figured you hadn't found anybody to help us because I hadn't heard any school bell ring. So then when Yana, coming home from her bread peddling, saw me rushing along the dike with the saw and shovel, I purposefully plunged down the dike and disappeared. By now, Giannis rushed home to Shora to tell everybody old Douwe's gone clean out of his head," he chuckled. "You watch, it won't be long before the women will be coming out along the dike. They all baby me so." He tied the rope around Lena's chest. "But down with you now, and get that wheel dug free before the tide comes sweeping in. Ready? Down you go." Yana dropped her yoke and bread baskets in the street, ran up the stoop of old Douwe's house, and stormed into the front room. "Yanka, are you there?" she yelled through the house. There were stumbling noises in the kitchen. Yanka, Douwe's granddaughter, came running. "Is something wrong?" "You've got to face it, Yanka. It's finally come, Yana told the woman somberly. Your grandfather's mind has finally gone back on him. There he was, running out along the dike with the saw and a shovel to get his father out again, and his old father dead and gone these 60 years. Oh no, Yanka said weakly, and only this morning we were talking about it. How sound grandfather was staying in mind and body, and he going on 94 and walking way to Ternod every day. Well, I saw him running out in the direction of the old boat with a saw and shovel. But he was gone all day on his long walk. Where would he have gone? Where would he have got a saw and shovel? A saw? Wait a minute. Yanka dashed out of the room. Yana, left behind alone, looked out of the window. She saw Lena's mother, evidently going to the store. At least she had a shopping basket on her arm. Yana rushed out to the stoop. Lena, she called urgently. Lena, can you come a moment? Yana had put some mystery and calamity into her call that by the time Lena's mother reached the stoop, all the women of Shora had been alerted. Curtains were pushed back and placed behind windows, and on almost every stoop appeared a woman. Some came with brooms to make it look as if they just innocently come out at that particular moment to sweep their stoops. Others leaned out and craned their necks honestly. Even Grandmother Sybil III had come out. To everybody's relief, Yana now began making motions for all the women to come. They bustled down the street. Unable to follow, Grandmother Sybil settled herself on her stoop and sat rocking herself back and forth in inquisitive impatience. She held a forgotten piece of rock candy between thumb and forefinger. The women reached the stoop just as Yanka, Douwe's granddaughter, burst out of the house. You're right, Yana, Yanka said hysterically. She was pale with fright. He did take the saw. The saw is gone. There it's hung over the fireplace all these years, but it's gone. He must have come in when I went to the store. What is it? What is this? Lena's mother demanded. It's old Douwe gone out of his mind, Lena, and your girl Lena was running after him, Yana told her soberly. But what can that poor tyke do with a strong old man gone out of his mind? He can be so stubborn, Douwe's granddaughter said. And all the men out at sea, one of the women exclaimed. Then with one accord, talking excitedly, the women set off for the dike. That's right, one of the women suddenly remembered. There isn't a man in Shora, not even the teacher and your Janus, Yana. Yana whirled on her. My Janus? Yes, left his yard and cherry tree, left Shora with a rake, went with the teacher and 4 boys pushing him in the wheelchair. Yana wouldn't believe it for a moment. Not my Janus, she said firmly. Boys pushing him? Ha! Not my Janus. Well, make me out as a liar then, the other retorted hotly. But I saw him. Why, I even called after him. Janus, what's wrong? What's happened? Do you know what he yelled at me over his shoulder as he flew by? Nothing, woman, nothing's wrong. But I haven't had so much fun since that shark bit off my legs. Shark bit off his legs? Yana muttered, completely mystified. What is this? Is everybody going out of his mind? They passed Grandmother Sybil's stoop. What's happening? Yana shouted at the old lady. You see everything going on in this village. What's happening in Shora, Grandmother Sybil? In their haste, none of the women could possibly wait for an answer, and Grandmother Sybil made no attempt to reply. She watched them rush off to the dike. She chuckled to herself. What's happening, Yana, is a wagon wheel for storks, she said softly to herself. She rocked herself in delight and stuck the piece of candy in her mouth. The women of Shora rushed up the dike steps, dreading what they might see on the other side. On top of the dike, the women stood in a row and stared into the distance where the old upturned boat loomed. On the boat, they could see the stooped figure of Douwe. He was kneeling and was sawing with all his might. "But where's Lena?" Lena's mother demanded. The women searched the empty strand. There was no girl anywhere in sight in all the dry distance of the sea bottom. "Oh no!" a woman suddenly exclaimed. She pointed. "Isn't that the tide coming in?" Far away toward the islands and almost beyond their sight, a thin, crawling silvery line was forming. "There!" the pointing woman said urgently. "Can't you see it? Over there, right over against the islands." "It is the tide!" Another woman saw it at last. "The tide's coming. We've got to get Douwe down from that boat before he gets cut off from the dike. At high tide, that whole boat goes under." They ran. They ran clumsily in their billowing heavy skirts and wooden shoes. The tide was faster. The thin, innocent-looking silvery line that had been so far away it could hardly be seen came with a slithering, snaky rush. Right on behind the ground tide rushed the deeper tide, deepening moment by moment until, far out at sea, a great wall of water formed itself and came roaring toward the land. Old Douwe on the boat glanced briefly out to sea. "Have you got that wheel dug free?" he shouted down the hold to Lena. "The tide'll be here in a few minutes." "Almost," Lena said, "but it's so big and such a long way to dig around." She dug frantically again. Lena dug, and the old man sawed. "It's free," Lena shouted up a moment later. She stopped for breath. "I've been trying to set it up, but I can't even stir it. It's so heavy." As she was talking, the first hissing line of bottom water slid swiftly under the boat and curled coldly around her toes. Lena gasped. "Oh, it's here," she yelled. "The water's here." The old man stooped down to the hole. "Can you climb a rope?" "No," Lena said promptly. "I've tried lots of times, but dresses get in your way." "Well, take the dress off." There was a little silence. "Oh, I don't know. Should I? Can't you pull me up?" "Listen, tides take no time for modest little girls. That rope's got to be tied to the wheel. How else are we going to pull it up out of there? Tie the rope to the wheel. I'll hold the rope taut and you climb it. If we don't do it that way, we won't have a wheel." Again there was a silence. Then a small voice called, "I've tied the rope around the wheel and my dress around my neck. I'm ready." The old man straddled the hole, stretching the rope tight while Lena climbed. Now the women of Shora had gathered on the point of the dike opposite the old boat. The tide had kept them from getting to it and had driven them back to the dike. They stood shouting frantic words at Douwe across the distance, but the old man was too occupied with straining at the rope and holding it steady for Lena to answer. As she climbed, Lena heard the women's sharp shrieks. Now her head came up through the hole. The old man reached down with one hand to grasp her, but Lena saw the women. "Oh, my mother," she gasped, "and me with my dress off. Oh, will I catch it?" "I'm standing in their way, and the moment I pull you out, I'll even turn my back," old Douwe said. He grinned at her and lifted her out. Behind the old man's broad back, Lena hastily unknotted the dress. "All right now," she whispered. At the first sight of Lena's mother had rushed down the dike. She'd run into the water a little way toward the boat. The rushing ground swell of the tide sent the water up over her knees. Knee-deep in water, she stood screaming, "Lena, come now, or it will be too late." Come down, the chorus of women screamed desperately from the dike. Now Douwe's granddaughter, Yanka, rushed down into the sea after Lena's mother. "Let yourself slide and run through the water, both of you. You can still do it." "Get a farmer," Douwe shouted back to her. "Get a farmer to come with a horse and wagon. That's all we need." He chuckled to himself when he saw the women on the dike turn and disappear over the crest of the dike to run to one of the farms around Shora. Only Lena and Yanka, the mother and the granddaughter, still hovered beneath the dike. They stood close together, clutching each other in order to stay on their feet, but bit by bit the rising tide forced them back to the dike. Lena, it's way over our knees. It's your last chance now, Lena's mother screamed. Are we going to stay here? Lena asked Douwe desperately. Yep, the old man said. He was calmly fishing his pipe from his pocket. What your mother doesn't realize is that if now it's over their knees there below the dike, it's over your head right there. But the old boat is high. It'll be easily an hour before the tide goes over the boat, so you and I will stay here high and dry until help comes. That's why I sent them for a horse and wagon, not only to get us two off, but to get that waterlogged wheel to shore too. He chuckled as he filled his pipe and looked out to sea. Lena paced back and forth on the boat. Now you'd better yell to your mother to get back on that dike before the real sweep of the tide knocks her off her feet. See, there it comes. The old man pointed to the great wall of water rushing toward them from out the deep, distant sea. He began lighting his pipe. Mother, get back! Get back! Lena called across the rushing water. It's coming! Hurry, run up on the dike. We're all right here. Her mother and Yanka plunged through the deepening water and scurried up the dike. But near the bottom of the dike, the two women whirled desperately. Once more a scream came across to the boat as the wall of the water came thundering. What will we do? Oh, what will we do? You'd better sit down here with me, Douwe told Lena. Pacing back and forth on this slippery boat, you might slide off. Sitting is safer. Just let them scream. It makes them feel a little better. The others are getting a farmer, and that's all needs to be done. Even if the tide goes over the boat before the farmer gets here, we'll just get our feet wet. And since you're young and don't have to worry about rheumatism, when it comes that high, I'll just have to sit on your shoulders. Lena choked and gave the old man an astonished look. Then she laughed. His jokes and his calmness were beginning to quiet her. She sat down beside the old man and laid her hand in his. I never knew you were so funny, she said gratefully. I didn't know people were funny when they were old. The old man was pleased. There, that's much better. No sense running up and down this boat like a headless chicken. But Lena had to stand up a moment. Mother, we're really all right up here, she yelled as loud as she could. There's nothing to worry about, Douwe says, and Mother, we've got a wheel. She settled herself beside the old man. Isn't this exciting? We've got a wheel and you and I got it. Mother, we're all right here, she shouted suddenly. Douwe knows. But this time she didn't get up to shout. She won't believe me anyway, she told the old man. She held his hand tightly as the wall of water, with the searing, cutting noise, and then a thunderous roar, rushed threateningly deep along the old boat and onto the dike. Behind the wall of water, the sea surrounded the boat and lapped up against its rounded sides. Isn't this exciting? Lena whispered. She clung to the old man. All right. See you in chapter 9.